Good evening, I'm Britt Clennett in Hong Kong and welcome to ViuTV News. Coming up on tonight's show. Polls open to croissants, coffee and topless protesters as divisive French presidential runoff election gets underway. And another funding request on its way to LegCo, this time for a healthy cause. The government plans to kick off Kai Tak public hospital construction soon. Hong Kong's blood inventories to return to normal after dipping to an alarming low. French voters are heading to the polls in what is widely considered the country's most important election in decades, with far-right candidate Marine Le Pen up against centrist Emmanuel Macron. The election is seen as the most important in France for decades. As polls opened in the country, commotion broke out as a feminist group protested outside Le Pen's polling station. The topless demonstrators unfurled a banner, "Marine in power, Marianne in despair," a reference to France's national symbol of liberty. The women were detained by police. It's an indication of how divided the country is, with the two candidates set to lead the country down two very different paths. Centrist candidate Emmanuel Macron is calling for closer ties with Europe and an open market economy. His rival Marine Le Pen wants the opposite, to close borders and quit the euro. French citizens have been casting their ballots at polling stations across the world. Here in Hong Kong, people arrived from 8 o'clock this morning to get their votes in. Although miles away from France itself, there was evidence of a stark division of opinion.
It's the future of France, and especially this election, which is very important because it's an extreme side that's against more like a center. So it's very important to, at least for me, to go to vote to make sure that extreme is not going to win over.
What I said, strong, can represent the French and defend the interest of the French. Especially, to help the economy.
Over in Washington, D.C., age was no barrier.
This election has been going well. Of course, there were some trials and tribulations, just like in the American election, but that is to be expected. On the whole, I'm very hopeful, and I'm glad I came to vote, even though I am in my 90th year.
It's clear French citizens around the globe are eager to have a say in who will lead France in an election which is likely to have major impacts on the country, Europe, and the world. Now, after the president is chosen, the French will then vote in parliamentary elections in a few weeks' time. Earlier, we spoke to University of Hong Kong professor Roland Vogt, who said even if Macron is elected, it could be an uphill battle for him to push through reforms if he doesn't get majority parliament support. But he believes a Macron win could have a big global impact.
Worldwide, I think it would be an interesting sign to see, especially if Monsieur Macron manages to capitalize in the parliamentary election to stem back the tide of populism that we've seen in several countries taking foothold. And so that could be an important sign that maybe voters are starting to become a little bit more skeptic of these populist propositions that are being made.
To local news now, and we have some good news for those living in the New Territories East. The government is expected to start consulting lawmakers soon on the construction of details of the Kai Tak public hospital. That would pave the way for a preliminary funding request of $1.15 billion. The 2,400-bed hospital will be the largest in Hong Kong and will provide a full range of services, including an emergency room. Sources say the government will start inviting tenders this month for the construction. Some lawmakers are worried that the administration won't be able to get the request through before its term ends in July.
If there is opposition against other items on the Finance Committee's agenda or some lawmakers deem it necessary to stage a filibuster, the hospital's funding request might well be delayed. In truth, LegCo affairs are much more complicated these days.
Well, Hong Kong's blood supply is set to return to a normal level after plunging to an alarming low earlier this week. The Red Cross Centre in Causeway Bay was packed with donors today. This comes after the organisation issued an urgent appeal for blood donations on Thursday after revealing it only has supply enough for 4 days. Over the past 2 days, more than 2,500 bags of blood were donated. Secretary for Food and Health Koh Man said this means the organisation's supply should return to a normal level soon. Well, today marks the 50th anniversary of the 1967 riots. Close to 100 people gathered at the Wo Hop Shek Cemetery to commemorate those who died during the clashes. More than 10 people who died during the riots are buried in the Fanling Cemetery. Members of the 67 Synergy group, formed by some of the jailed demonstrators, were among those who showed up today. The group claims those who died are heroes, not rioters. The 1967 riots was a protest against British colonial rule that left dozens dead and hundreds injured. And Boko Haram militants have released 82 schoolgirls they kidnapped 3 years ago in exchange for prisoners. However, the Nigerian government has not disclosed how many Boko Haram suspects have been exchanged. The girls are among the 200-odd students abducted from a Chibok secondary school back in April 2014. More than 20 were released last October, while a number have escaped or been rescued. Around 195 were believed to be still in captivity before this release. Pope Francis has criticised the US for naming its biggest non-nuclear explosive the mother of all bombs. Speaking to an audience in Vatican City, the Pope said he was ashamed when he heard the name because a mother gives life and the bomb does the opposite. He also added the world is at war. The pontiff's comments come ahead of a meeting with US President Donald Trump on May the 24th. It's seen as a potentially awkward encounter given the pair's opposing views on immigration, refugees and climate change. Well, coming up next, the latest from the world of business with Pamela Ambler.
Hi there. Puerto Rico filed for one of the biggest local government bankruptcies in U.S. history earlier this week. Here's Conway Gittins to explain what this can mean for the island and its debt holders.
Holders of Puerto Rican debt scrambling after the island filed for what is technically the biggest ever bankruptcy of a local government in U.S. history. Putting the process of figuring out who gets paid and how much into the hands of the court is just the beginning of what is likely to be a long and difficult process, says Reuters correspondent Nick Brown.
We're not exactly sure how much of Puerto Rico's $70 billion in debt are going to be included in this filing, but probably the bulk of it. Well, it's going to be really tough because there are a few different fights that need to be had. On the one hand, creditors can't agree with each other about who has priority over whom. You have creditors whose debt is backed by Puerto Rican sales tax, and they think that they have a dedicated lien on that revenue stream. And then you have creditors whose debt is backed by the full faith and credit of the Commonwealth, and they say nobody can touch that.
And that's just round one of the battle. Round two, the fight over how much money the island should spend to pay off its debts and where that money should come from. Puerto Rico is suffering through a decade-long recession, resulting in a massive population flight to the mainland. And for those who remain, 45% live in poverty and 11% are unemployed. This whole bankruptcy process could take well over a year to work its way through the courts. In the meantime, Puerto Ricans are likely to see living conditions worsen as officials struggle to find money to pay off what they hope will eventually be a smaller debt and grow the economy at the same time.
Sweeping energy reforms have turned Mexico into one of the world's most attractive offshore prospects, but one segment is getting no love from U.S. investors, and that's the nation's aging refineries. Efforts by Mexico's state-owned oil company Pemex to attract about $5 billion in capital to help modernize its two largest refineries so far have proved futile, according to sources familiar with the process. Among those to turn down the overtures from Pemex are U.S. refining giants Valero Energy and Tesoro, but Pemex denies they are struggling to find investors. Apple is making a play to hitch sales onto services in China. This is as iPhone sales slipped in the first quarter. The tech giant is pushing everything from digital payment to online games. The strategy makes sense given China drove 50% of growth through the App Store this last year, and the smartphone market is fiercely competitive with local rivals crowding the marketplace. But that's not to say that approach doesn't come with its own problems, especially competing as a foreign brand.
It comes with a lot of separate risks which aren't involved in hardware. So there's a lot of things that the Chinese government has been cracking down on in the last year, including live streaming, including media, including games, and all of these things fit into Apple's new services ecosystem. We can expect that they're going to come into conflict with regulators on the content side a lot more compared to when they're just selling straight hardware.
And coming up, auction powerhouses Sotheby's, Christie's, and Phillips are gearing up for their big spring art sale, and hopes are high that major pieces will fetch a strong, even record prices. The auction kicks off on May 15th with Christie's Impressionist and Modern Art sales featuring a 1939 Picasso portrait of his muse Dora Maar right there, which is expected to fetch between 35 to 50 million US dollars. And over at Sotheby's, Jean-Michel Basquiat's untitled work from 1982 last auctioned